All right, so now we're recording. All right, at the door. All right. And who brought, lovely, who brought snacks? Great, thank you, Aaron. Nice spread. So you can enjoy that at the break. And as was suggested, you can go outside, get a little fresh air. It's a beautiful day. I apologize for not being outside. So I want to start with just a short exercise, and that is, let's see if we can name some female characters from Torah, Tanakh, Rabbinic Judaism. Let's just get some names on the board.
Sarah, Rebecca, Leah.
Very good. So why don't we put like matriarchs? Okay. Who else? Miriam.
Ruth.
Who else?
Ruth.
Ruth. Great.
Esther.
May you be like Ruth and Esther.
Yael.
Yael. Okay, so now we're, starting Ruth, Esther, Yael, we're now into the other portions of not just Torah, but Nach, right? Yeah?
Judith.
Who else? Naomi. Okay, good. Hi, welcome. Naomi. Judith. Okay.
Delilah.
Delilah.
This is like women, right?
That's good, yeah. She's a woman.
Sarah.
Sarah, well, we should have our matriarchs there. I just kind of put Eve. Yeah, it's interesting that we didn't name Eve, that it took a long time. I didn't say name Jewish female characters. I said
Noah's wife.
Noah's wife. Oh, I love that.
Right.
Right. Noah's wife. Okay, we won't call her Mrs. Noah, but she doesn't really have a name.
And lots of wives.
And Lot's wife also doesn't have a name. I mean, she had a name, but we don't know what it is. Okay, so that's a good start, right? Anyone want to try someone from Rabbinic Judaism? Know any female characters from Rabbinic Judaism?
Rashi's daughters.
So that's later Rabbinic Judaism, that's true. I'm thinking of like in the Talmud, Mishnah, those kinds of things. There's a couple that come to mind. I might put Bruria. Anyone heard of Bruria? Okay. Who was the wife of Rebbe Meir. And she's an interesting character. And I might also put Serach bat Asher, who's actually a biblical character, but she's only named in a couple of genealogies in the Torah, but she's a whole midrashic life that comes out in later rabbinic literature. Okay, so just thinking about these characters for a second. And the Benot Tzavchad, they're good as well. There's the daughters, the 5 daughters of Tzavchad. Can you name them all? No. Okay. Noah, Milcah, Tirzah, Chogla, and I always forget the 5th. Anyway, that's 4 of the 5. Noah's become a very popular name for girls. Chogla less so. All right. So let's just start with I started with brainstorming. We're talking about gender today, which is, this is one gender, but there's obviously another gender, and these days I think we're coming to understand that there are more genders than that. But as long as we sort of stick with the kind of classic binary here, starting with female characters in some ways is easier because
Not very many.
the vast majority of the characters in Torah, Tanakh, Rabbinic literature are guys, right? So starting with females in some ways already shines a light on the crux of the challenge, which is in talking about gender, we're starting with a pretty overtly patriarchal textual tradition that saw fit, that was, largely written by men, and also saw fit to highlight the stories and opinions of men over and above the stories and opinions of women. Let's name a little bit about gender roles in Jewish tradition. If I were to ask you, right, and I have this as our opening discussion, what are some examples of gender roles? Did everybody get a roadmap? here if you didn't. What are some examples of gender roles in Jewish tradition, Torah, rabbinic Judaism? Which are normative? Which challenge the dominant paradigm? So, of the characters that we put up here, what are gender roles typically?
Mother,
Mother,
wife,
okay.
temptress.
Temptress, okay. So mother, wife, give me just an example.
Sarah.
Anyway, Sarah, okay.
All matriarchs.
Yeah, okay. Temptress, do you have a good example?
Delilah, Bathsheba.
Okay.
Maybe that's
Right. It's interesting you say Bathsheba because
She was.
she,
was the object.
right. But it's interesting that that's where we go, right? Assuming, right now, right, like that, of course, if David was smitten, it must have been somehow her fault, right? Because this is the trope. We have other kind of overt examples of that as well. Lilith, for example, who is more from the rabbinic Kabbalistic tradition, but who, seduces Adam and, has sex on top and all those kinds of terrible things. What else? Other roles. You can bring it up with Miriam later. What are the other roles? Is this being recorded? Other gender roles you can think of.
Raising children.
Raising children. Okay, that's a sort of a common one. Any that challenge the paradigm.
Well, Miriam's role is different.
Okay, how is Miriam's role
I
different?
mean, she has her own voice
Mhm.
and her own leadership.
Yeah. So what does she do? Like, in what way does she demonstrate that?
Well, her famous song, right?
Okay. Yeah. So there's like she leads the community. Now she just leads the women, right? That doesn't seem to be like she's leading everybody, but she does. But she also, if you remember, like takes ownership of looking after not only sort of looking after, but she looks after her brother, and she organizes, she sort of orchestrates this relationship between Yocheved and Bat Paro in an interesting way. Still relatively normative, but maybe she's pushing boundaries a little bit. Anyone who pushes maybe even a little more in Torah?
Who's the one who?
Yeah,
Okay, so Yael is a good example. Yael, and sometimes, she goes with Devorah, right? Devorah, who's the judge. Devorah is named as a judge.
Who's the one who posed as a temple prostitute? Who pretended to be the temple
Good. So that's Tamar, right? Okay, good. And then we have, Shifra and Pua, who are the midwives. So if we think about it, actually, we can start to come up with some interesting examples of those who really are kind of pushing back against those paradigms, right? Devorah, who's a judge, Yael, who's a military character who ends up kills Sisera by driving a tent peg through his head, Tamar, who seduces her father-in-law in order to make a point, to teach him a lesson that he has no right to deny her of her right to have children. Shifra and Pua, who, what do?
They say the male presence.
They defy the pharaohs.
They defy Pharaoh's rule, and they continue to deliver babies and save the babies, right? They're the midwives in Egypt. So we do have some interesting examples there.
The Slavkad daughters actually are, certain
Great.
property rights.
Yeah, and Benot Slavchad, who,
Because there was no male heir.
right, they actually get the law, Slavchad, they actually change the law and challenge sort of Moses' understanding, even God's understanding of the law, which is that the land should be inherited by male heirs, but what happens if there's no male heir? It would just simply go to the male next of kin. And the daughters of Slavchad said, wait a second, this is our dad's property, it should come to us. And in fact, God says, they have a good point. Now, it's a great example, and this in some ways is a good transition to looking at some of the sources, in a great example of how systemic oppressions continue, even after you would sort of challenge them. The next generation, this becomes a problem, and the Torah tells us, well, they have to sort of change it because, people got upset because what happens if like then they marry someone from a different tribe and now one tribal holding is moving to another tribe, and so they say, okay, they can retain their assets as long as they marry within their own tribe. So we still have a fair amount of patriarchy that comes into play there, but it's a great moment. It's like, don't sell short the victory. It's a great victory in a book where there aren't a lot of victories for female characters. All right. So let's dive into the sources, and I want to start with a little bit of Chavruta study at the beginning, and that's just on source 1 and 2. So wherever the beginning of the lesson 18 is for you,
197.
and let's just kind of divide in half, maybe have Aaron this way, you all do source 1, and John this way, you all do source 2. And you can break into 2 different groups, and here you can break into 3 different Chavrutas. But just look at those sources. Yeah, so this side is going to do text 1, this is going to do text 2. And see if you can just sort of identify some of the male-female gender roles that are depicted in these. These are going to be familiar text to you. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but just read them through aloud and see if you can identify what are the gender roles here. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. The Lord God formed man from the wait. Can you wait for a minute? I thought we were going into
Chavruta, yeah, but you can. You're abandoning your Chavruta. What's that? Oh, I just mean like 2, 2, 2, but you're all going to do first one.
I mean it, but you didn't say it.
Apologies if I wasn't entirely.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
It was understood by everybody, but it's nice. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Man became a living being. Lord God planted the garden and established that man had a form.
Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky.
The Lord God took the man and placed him in the garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die.
One could argue that
Are we 1 or 2? We're 1.
Sorry, okay, now we got
27 and 28.
Okay. And God created man in his image, and the Lord God created them. Male and female created them. God blessed them, and God said, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master the sea.
Okay, we're just going to do like 1 more minute. Just a quick look at this.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the whole thing.
The Lord God took the
Yeah.
man and placed him in the garden of Eden.
So in that one, you're not pulling
The
the
Lord
ribbon
God
out of
formed
there.
man and
Just create a
never created the garden of Eden.
Well, didn't it say something about man, him, and then man?
Yeah.
So like they both
God
were
created
created
man.
man in his image, and his image created him, male and female created them.
The Lord God
It's saying 2 things, right? It says saying it's to him,
and let him say,
but then it says God was with them, God said to them, so all this is man goes to both.
So far, it's equal agency, power.
So the Lord God has a deep
Equal obligation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
He took one of the
Yeah, well, actually, no power too, right?
Yeah.
Master.
Right.
Oh,
that's right, the leading of everything was the second.
Well, so in the first one,
Right.
But that's interesting.
No, although the
You
syntax.
know, maybe it's that maybe.
Implies that
All right, so we're going to wrap up in 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, because what you're getting at is how it's saying he created man in his image and created that in the image. Right.
Him.
Yeah, that's so then, and then of course collectively.
Later that it says.
Right.
And they, so there's, it really feels like they're 2 different
Right.
things.
Well, yeah, but what does it say, what does it mean?
All right, so let's come back together. I've taught, hour-long classes on just these verses. There's a lot here, but I just want to focus on the gender roles. Those who had Genesis 1. Anyone who's ever read Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith? So if you haven't read it, it's a classic. He talks about how there's Adam 1 and Adam 2, these sort of two different ways of being human. And he talks about sort of relating to the natural world, and there's a lot that we could say between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but here we're really interested in what are the similarities, dissimilarities when it comes to gender roles. So those who had Genesis 1, how are male and female, men and women depicted there?
Equally,
Equally. What makes you say that?
because it says, wait a minute, I lost my place. God created man, male and female, he created them.
Okay, so Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, and notice that actually the hey is important there, right? It is the man, which is to say in a gendered language, the human, right? God created the human, and then if you want to know about the particulars of that human, Zachar nekeva bara otam, God created the human with two different genders, male and female. Okay, so they seem to have been created simultaneously. And then just in case you're not unsure who's really in charge, what does it say in the next verse?
He's saying to them both.
What's that, Aaron?
He's saying to them both,
Mm-hmm.
be fertile and increase and rule fish.
So this notion of pru or vu et v'kivshu, right? And you should sort of conquer it and dominate it. It's not the males who are supposed to do that, it's the humans. Now that may open a whole other set of questions about our relationship with the planet, but at least it seems when it comes to gender roles that male and female, there's some parity there. What about Genesis 2? How does it appear there?
Not so equal.
Not so equal. And what are some examples of why that is?
Woman is depicted as the helper. Man is first, and then a woman comes along to kind of be his adjunct.
Okay, so man is created first. Rashi does a very clever thing where he says that the word sela, which means rib, can also mean side, and he talks about how the first, because he's trying to reconcile Genesis 1 and 2, and so actually this was a sort of dual sex or androgyne, which is divided in half. And it's an interesting argument, and Plato says something similar, but if we're just reading Genesis 2 on its merits, it seems that Genesis 2, the man is first, the woman comes later. She is playing this role as a sort of complementary helper. It
And
doesn't mean
also,
just
the man should not be alone.
yeah, so we get the statement, Lo tov heyot adam levado, that man should not be alone. Now again, that might be a statement about the sort of the nature of humanity, that we're social beings. That's certainly how I read it. But when we're looking at the gender roles, it's pretty clear she shows up later. She's made out of some part of his body. And what else?
Well, he does all the naming.
He does all the naming. She is somehow a derivative of him. What does he call her? He's Ish, and he names her Isha, right? Because she's a derivative of Ish. So female becomes in some ways defined in relationship to male, okay? And the vector is that. Male first, female second. Remember that, particularly when we look at Cynthia Ozick. What?
If you go back to what you were saying a couple of weeks ago about biblical authorship and scholarship, is there thoughts that there may be two different authors here?
Absolutely. So scholars consider generally one of them to be the J source and one to be the E source, and for sure. That's another way to look at these two narratives. You see it a lot in the story of Noah as well, the differences, yeah. Okay, so look at source 3, which is Genesis 3. Again, I haven't located my Tanakh yet, so I'm using my Sefaria here. Verse 14, and would somebody read for us 14 through 19?
Then the Lord God said to the serpent, because you did this, more cursed shall you be than all cattle and all the wild beasts. On your belly shall you crawl, and and the dirt shall you eat all the days of your life.
And what is the this? What has the serpent done?
Tempting.
Tempting Eve, who then tempts Adam to eat the fruit of the tree. Okay, go on.
I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They shall strike at your head, and you shall strike at their heel. And to the woman he said, I will make most severe your pangs in childbearing. In pain shall you bear children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. To Adam he said, because you did as your wife said, and ate of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you, but your food shall be the grasses of the field.
Okay, so yeah, we get the basic gist. Like, he's also going to suffer, but she's going to suffer specifically with childbirth. And right, anyone who's watching The Handmaid's Tale, like, you can see how language like this can be weaponized against women. I mean, that's sort of an extreme version of it, but okay, so these are familiar. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I want to get into some of the more modern commentaries and especially some of the female authors. But I think we need that as a backdrop. And the other thing we really need as a backdrop, and what I want you to consider, is what is the relationship between what we just read about women and their status and the relationship vis-a-vis men and the halachic woman, right? What is a woman's role in Jewish law? And to understand that, this is kind of the classic source to define women's role in the public sphere, right? In performative Judaism, in the public square, this is where women fall. So who wants to read this one from the Mishnah? Mishnah again, 2nd century, written down about the year 200 CE.
Men are obligated in any positive commandment that is dependent on time, or women are not. A positive commandment which is not time-bound is binding upon both men and women. And the negative commandment, whether or not it's dependent on time, is incumbent upon men.
Okay, so let's unpack this briefly. The last phrase is in some ways the easiest. A negative commandment. What's an example of a negative commandment?
Thou shalt not kill.
Right. It doesn't mean it's like a bad commandment. It just means it's something you shouldn't do as opposed to something that you should do. So, right? Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder, applies to women, men, or both? Both. Pretty clear. Prohibitions are prohibitions for everyone, okay? Whether or not, it's dependent on time, right? So if you're not allowed to light fire on Shabbat, that still applies to men and women, even though you can light fire on a Tuesday, but not on a Saturday, okay? The other issue here is this question of time-bound commandments and non-time-bound commandments, and positive and negative. And the basic rule, again, we could spend a lot more time on this, but the basic rule is mitzvot aseh shelo hazman grama. Positive time-bound commandments are obligatory to men, but not to women. Okay? Everyone got that? Positive time-bound commandments are obligatory for men in classic halacha, but not to women. So, can you think of an example? What's that? Laying tefillin. Why so tefillin is an affirmative, you should do it, it's not something you shouldn't do. And then why is it time bound?
Because you're supposed to do it in the morning. No.
In the morning, or broadly during the daytime. Right? Ideally you do it first thing in the morning because we should all sort of run to do a mitzvah first thing, but really it's during daytime hours. You're not supposed to wear tefillin at night. And because tefillin is time-bound and it's an affirmative, positive commandment, women are not obligated to it. Let's give them one or two other examples.
Praying 3 times a day.
Praying 3 times a day, okay? Or especially praying in a minyan.
In a minyan.
Right, okay, good.
Breaths.
A bris. Oh, interesting. Well, so there's an anatomical piece of that. But you're right, in some ways, maybe the father is obligated. Yeah, that's more, I think that's more of a complicated one. I think there are some more cleaner examples.
Sacrifice.
Okay, maybe sacrifices, which really prayer is in some ways a modern version of that and stuff.
Really, all of the temple rituals.
A lot of the temple rituals, yeah, are obligated to men and not to women. Wearing a talit is another one of these, because you do it during the day and not at night.
So here's one where, so what about Pesach? It says in the Tanakh, you should eat matzah on these days.
Yes.
But it's incumbent, so.
Oh my gosh, so all these.
So there are exceptions to the rule, and that's one of them, because it specifically says in the Torah that everyone is obligated, then everyone is obligated. And there are others. Look, I mean, lighting Shabbat candles. Were you going to say lighting Shabbat candles, right? So Aaron was thinking, right, there's an obvious positive time-bound commandment that women very typically do, and that's like, so there are exceptions, but the general rule of thumb. Now, why is that? Any guesses as to why that would be?
Because a woman is childbearing, giving birth.
Taking care of
Taking
the kids,
care.
taking care of the home.
All right,
That's
great.
fine.
So let's read some Saul Berman. Saul Berman is a modern Orthodox rabbi. We're now on text 5. And let's read some of Saul Berman. Who wants to read? Had the Torah intended?
Had the Torah intended to preclude women for all roles, excuse me, but that of wife, mother, homemaker, the means of doing so were easily at hand. Much as the law clearly prescribed the obligations of a husband to his wife, obligations of a father to his child, and obligations of children to their parents, the law could have made mandatory for women not only marriage and procreation, but also the entire range of household duties, which would have defined an exclusive role for them. The law ends up mandating for women neither marriage nor procreation nor specific household duties. We would like this not then to find any precision whatsoever a proper and necessary role for Jewish women. While not demanding adherence to one particular role, it is nevertheless the essence for most of our history, our continuation as a people depended upon the voluntary selection by women of the role of wife, mother, homemaker. The law would encourage the exercise of that choice.
Okay. Who wants to keep reading?
Indeed, the Torah modified the civil and religious demands it made upon Jewish women to assure that no legal obligation could possibly interfere with her performance of that particular role. A woman elected to discover her fulfillment in the relation to her husband and children and in the shaping of a home, no law would stand in the way of her performance of that trust. It is for that reason, I believe, that the primary category of means vote from which women were exempted were those which would either mandate or make urgently preferable a communal appearance on their part.
Why don't you do a little bit more?
In the light of this proposition, we can understand why there was complete unanimity as to the Torah's having exempted women from the mitzvot of Sukkah, Lulav, and Shofar. These acts were of necessity performed outside of the home. We may likewise understand why it was necessary for the Torah to specifically inform us that women were obligated to attend the reading of the Torah at Hachel, and why it was so obvious that they were included in the mandatory restrictions of Yom Kippur. Finally, we may now better understand the reason for the debates as to whether women were exempted from such mitzvot as tefillin, tzitzit, and the reading of the Shema. For while obligations such as these need not involve communal appearance, and can adequately be fulfilled at one's home, their very association with communal worship would create, and indeed has created for men, a powerful religious preference for their performance within the context of communal presence.
All right, who wants to finish it off? David?
The underlying motive of exemption would then be neither the attempt to unjustly deprive women of the opportunity to achieve religious fulfillment, nor the proposition that women are inherently more religiously sensitive. Rather, the exemption would be a tool used by the Torah to achieve a particular social goal, namely to assure that no legal obligation would interfere with the selection by Jewish women of a role which was centered almost exclusively in the home.
Okay. What's he trying to say? Well, who's he responding to? Well, let's start. What is he trying to say, and then we'll get to who's he responding to.
He seems to say that this is an attempt to open choices,
Mm-hmm. Whose choices?
women's choices.
Women's choices, right? Right? It's nevertheless clear that since most of our history are continuations of people dependent on the voluntary selection by women of the role of wife, mother, homemaker, the law would indeed encourage the exercise of that choice.
How
Women want to play that role. The law is burdensome. It asks a lot of you. Why should we place an obstacle in the way of women being able to fulfill the role which they have placed upon themselves? Everyone totally buys into this, right? Like this is something.
Doesn't sound very voluntary.
Okay. So let's just name it. Who wants to name like what's problematic with this argument?
What if a woman doesn't want to have children?
Well, but if the social role is not actually voluntary.
Right.
I mean, that's the,
Right.
Even
So there
if
could
it's
be
not
individual
legally
choices may not be in line, or sort of, yeah.
Even if it's not sort of legally, like politically mandated, it's like socially mandated, and so it's like, oh, well, see, the way is clear for you to make this totally voluntary choice.
well, and the creation of the legal norms, the idea that that there's a lack of recognition that the creation of the legal norms themselves drives the social, what is his term? Social roles that he's saying are voluntarily chosen, when it's really the opposite. I don't know if I said that clearly.
All right.
Well, but it's not exactly the opposite, and that's the problem. I mean, it's saying you're free to do whatever, moves you. Everyone is really kind of doing this, and there's this expectation, but if you want to do that, you can. That's
really-
No, that's what I was trying to say is that he's saying, he's saying that the legal norms that he's talking about somehow exist independent of or separately from the social norms that he's saying drive the legal norms, and what I'm saying is, no, they're not separate, and in fact,
Right.
the very existence of these legal norms is is reifying and helping to drive the social norms that he's talking about.
Right, I wasn't disagreeing with what you were taking away from it.
I'm really curious to your question, who's he responding to? So this is
Yeah.
Yeshiva University, Modern Orthodox in 1989, when there's actually, the world around is actually, before 19, but it was written in 1989.
Right.
And the world around this is basically, the gender roles are rapidly changing.
Right.
Everywhere around. And I almost got a sense this is like, an apologist of rationalization.
Totally. And in some ways, so I think he's actually doing two things simultaneously. On one hand, he's responding to the apologists who say, look, women don't need these things. They're on a higher spiritual plane. Ever heard this? Right? Like women they're closer to God. Men, we have all these urges. We need to bind ourselves with tefillin to sort of constrain ourselves because our testosterone just gets in the way of everything. Which actually I think we're learning is kind of true. But like that's sort of that's the argument, right?
Yeah,
We need these restrictions. Right? Have you ever seen like some Hasidic man that was like where a guard told they tie up to separate your lower half from your upper half because you want the lower half to thing for the upper half. So like there's a sense of like that's out there, and I think he is rightly responding to that tendency, which is to say that women are just better, and that's why they don't have to. And he says, look, that's not what it's about, right? This is about, for him, women's empowerment. Women are choosing not to do that, which then sort of leads to the second question. Is he, and I would say there are certainly Orthodox folks in his wake, and he's still around, who have absolutely sort of taken their cue from this sort of thinking saying, well, wait a second, if at some point these are no longer societal norms and women collectively choose something else, actually maybe we need to make room within the halakha, which brings me back to the whole thing from the Mishnah. Because remember, how is the Mishnah used? When we say positive time commandments, does it say that anywhere that a woman may not wear tefillin? Or that may not read from the Torah? Or may not wear, like there are other ones that are like, you know, witnessing, and those are sort of different issues, still problematic from where I sit, but those are different issues. But, you know, folks like Saul Berman and those in the sort of modern open Orthodox movement, the ones who are starting partnership minyanim, like Shira Hadashah in Jerusalem and others, are saying, wait a second, it says she is not obligated, right? The problem is that usually, well, let me finish that thought, she's not obligated, it doesn't say that she is not allowed. Right, so if women as a class or a woman individual decides that she wants to wear tefillin, who's to prevent them? Right, and that's actually what Rabbi Joe Roth and the conservative movement did when they started ordaining female conservative rabbis, was to say that women need to take on the obligation, the personal obligation to all of those positive time-bound commandments in order to become rabbis. But if they so choose, they may do that, and then they are obligated just the way that men are. Last thought, and then I'll sort of open it up again. In modern Orthodoxy, or in classic Orthodoxy, the way that this was typically used, and in, to a certain extent in the conservative movement of yesteryear, the halachic move that keeps women from doing these things is to say what? Right? What's the argument against this? That, you know, some Orthodox rabbis, most Orthodox rabbis would still make about, may my daughter wear tefillin? Or may she read from the Torah?
Because it's not commanded that they should.
Because you don't have an obligation,
Then you're taking away
therefore
the obligation of
you are diminishing those who do have an obligation. And so the argument to me why, for example, women are supposed to read from the Torah, the language is Mishum Kavod Hatzibor. I'll write it in transliteration. Mishum Kavod Hatzibor.
So that's the argument?
Well, it's like you're suggesting that none of these guys
For
are capable
the, right,
of doing
for
it.
the honor of the tzibor, of the community. Right, which is to say, if women get up there and do all these things that they don't have to do,
And that
they're going to somehow diminish or maybe even embarrass the men who are supposed to be doing it and may not know how, right? Or may not do it the way they should do it. And so, for the sake of the community, in order to preserve the integrity of the community, women ought not do these things, even though technically they're allowed to. That's the move. I just want us to kind of be aware of that. And the other piece of it is that if you are not obligated when it comes to communal things, you're not allowed to fulfill somebody else's obligation because you personally don't have the obligation. So the problem with like being a shaliach tzibor, leading the community in prayer, is that when I say amen, I'm affirming what's been said. If the person saying the blessing didn't have an obligation to say the blessing in that context, and I say amen, in some ways I'm affirming what they call a bracha levatala, like a nullified,
Like a wasted bracha.
a wasted bracha, right? Because she didn't have to say it, so how can I possibly affirm it and then fulfill my own obligation for having said it? Is that clear?
Well,
I'm not saying it makes sense, but everybody understands. So Saul Berman is in some ways responding within Orthodoxy to that tendency to say, wait a second, actually these are choices that women make. And in his own framing, because this is a pluralistic course, in his own framing, he would be saying, right, women may make different choices at some point, and we may need as a community to figure out how to make space for those choices. And in fact, that's what we're starting to see in some versions of Orthodoxy now, right? Women rabbis, women doing it. Okay, let's open it up for a couple of minutes, and then I do want to spend a good amount of time on some of the others. Yeah.
And they both seem like post hoc rationalizations for patriarchy inside of it. But so if you go back to Mission as we read and as described, there were no prohibitions against women doing some of these things. Just weren't obligated. So that sort of implies something element. When did some of these things become European constructs?
I mean, it's hard to say. Even probably in the Mishnaic and Talmudic period, some of these things were not done. And in some ways they pop up maybe as, some say Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. So it actually may have been more restrictive originally and less restrictive. What's unclear, and I'm not a legal scholar, so what I can't tell you is, when the rabbis say that men are obligated and women are not, did they really mean that women are not permitted? And I don't know enough about Jewish legal development to tell you the answer to that. There are those who do know that answer, but I don't. Other thoughts, questions?
Where is Berman? So basically, YU has gone all the way to the right, and Avi Weissing, that group is actually. So where is he now?
Berman is. I think he still tends to be toward the left. I don't think he's reached the kind of persona non grata status that Avi Weiss has, but he's definitely on the left. Yeah. All right, so let's do Cynthia Ozick. I think it's time we start listening to women. So let's read a woman. That's good. I thought about this long, and I thought about skipping. Yeah, Mark?
Our synagogue ritual committee just met the other day. We were talking about the question of can a non-Jew open the ark? And one of the arguments is that if you have a non-Jew open the ark, it diminishes the honor for everyone else. So it sounded very similar to what you were saying, why women shouldn't. So is that the same argument?
Very interesting. That may be where that's coming from.
Same categories of non-Jew.
Yes, that's very interesting.
And it's also,
yeah.
I mean, that's definitely the argument for why somebody who is can't lead the service. Can't lead the service.
Right.
Or having a leader.
but it's also the same argument that was or still is used about why we shouldn't have same-sex marriage. The notion was somehow gay people getting married is going to diminish the marriages of every heterosexual person.
We have a lot of power. Everyone else is
Aaron, do you want to start us on?
I don't have any feelings about that.
Text 6. It's a long text, but I want to try to do it because it's really so good. Go ahead.
Under Halakha, women are seen as a subdivision of humanity, not as the main class itself. Now, a subdivision is, by definition, not the fundamental rule, but rather a somewhat deviating instance of the fundamental rule, a step apart from the norm. Under Halakha, the male is the norm and the female is a class apart. For instance, there is a tractate entitled Nashim, or women, but there is no corresponding tractate called men, because clearly all that does not apply to women falls to men. Men are the rule and women are the exception to the rule.
Let's, maybe we'll just kind of go around for anyone who wishes to read. Mark, you want to read in the spirit?
Nevertheless, the explicators of halakha, one hesitates to use the term apologists, claim that the biblical male and female created he them means quite simply equality of the sexes in the eye of the Creator. And so far, so good. It is only when we come to examine equality halakhically that we discover that it is meant to signify not equal, but complementary. Male and female are viewed as halves of a whole, goes the argument, and each half has its own separate rights and responsibilities. There are distinct roles for men and women which overlap very little.
When complementary is taken to be the relation between the norm and its deviation, or the rule and its exception, then the role of the norm will be understood to be superior to the role of the exception. When equal is defined as
in scripture.
Okay, so just shades of Jim Crow, if you're still paying attention, right?
Yeah.
Separate but equal, go ahead.
We read in scripture that Deborah was a judge in Israel. Under post-biblical halakhic rules, a woman may not be a witness. In this debarment, she is in a category with children and imbeciles.
That's true, by the way. So oftentimes in the Talmud, women are, there's like, we talk about nashim, you know, isha, it's not yelid, but I forget the exact, and a shotet, right? It's that, those three often go together. Women, children, and imbeciles is how they were using the language, right? We wouldn't use language like that today, but that's common. Go ahead.
Yeah. You wanna go?
Yeah, we need one more to short,
finish.
yeah.
In
She
the,
is
in
exempt.
the halakhic view, a woman is not a juridical adult.
She is exempted from liturgical and other responsibilities that are connected with observing a particular practice at a specific time. This, as it is explained, is a compassionate and sensible rule. What? Shall she be obliged to abandon the baby at her breast to run to join a prayer or at a festival?
And that's the argument that we were talking about before. This is, of course, the choice that women made for themselves in order to be home and not have to bother to run to shul all the time, 3 times a day.
But a man can't breastfeed.
I mean, I've never tried, but I doubt it.
Maybe wouldn't get much.
Go ahead.
The so-called compassionate and sensible rule perceives a woman exclusively as a biological figure. Time-fixed communal responsibility is left exclusively to males, as if milk were the whole definition of parenthood, or as if, in fact, milk were the whole definition of a woman, or as if in each marriage there is to be only one reliably committed parent, the one with the milk, or as if a mother, always and without exception, is in charge of sucklings only.
If the context is changed from functional to intrinsic, from the identity of relationship to the identity of essence, from the ideal of extenuation to the ideal of inclusiveness, then compassionate exemption is transmogrified into demeaning exclusion. To exempt is to exclude is to debar is to demote is to demean. Young girls, older women, and unmarried women do not have babies at their breasts. Where is the extenuating ideal for them? They are exempted, i.e. excluded, debarred from public worship all the same.
The halakhic rationale of a universal female exemption, however, is not based on compassion for harried mothers, nor is it, as some erroneously believe, related to any menstrual taboo. It rests on a single phrase, kavod hatzibur, which can be read in English as the honor or self-respect of the community. One infers that a woman's participation would degrade the community.
I'm not shocked by the use of this rationale. I am perhaps shocked that the halakhic scholar of my acquaintance refers to the phrase the honor of the community as a concept that seems to defy comprehension. Indeed, I welcome this phrase as wonderfully illuminating. It supports and has total clarity to the idea that the duties and the status of women is a social, not a sacred question. Social status is not sacral, cannot be interpreted as divinely fixed, it can be repented of and repaired.
Reactions, questions. Does it speak to you? Does it not speak to you? Does it help frame any of your thinking around this?
It's a pretty devastating critique, seems to me.
Did she write the whole thing tongue-in-cheek? Was it meant to be satirical?
I mean, I didn't read it as satire.
No.
I think it's a pretty,
Like she believed the opposite of what she was saying?
no, I think she believes what she's saying.
Why do you think she believes the opposite?
Because the way I'm reading it, she's saying things that you would expect to be the norm. It's the right way to do things.
Well, that's what she's arguing against. I mean, she's characterizing what she sees as the orthodox position and saying it doesn't make any sense.
Right, and then
Yeah, well, that's why I said, the so-called compassionate, sensible ruling, that's why it seems satirical, it's the way she's saying things.
Well, she's definitely a little
Right.
cheeky.
I think
Like
it's,
she's, you know, she's.
I think it's,
Yes, I think
Yes.
sarcastic.
Yeah, sarcastic, I think might be
Yeah.
the word you're looking for.
nice, that's
Yeah.
She's also a gifted writer.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
helps.
She
Well,
She's a
think-
gifted writer, which helps.
Right.
But in a way, she's saying, you know, if you're looking back to Torah or other Tanakh, there's kind of like our number, there's all these women,
Mhm.
some of them doing very interesting things, and it's under halakha that we get this contraction of
Mhm.
women's roles.
Right. Very good.
And that doesn't, that can be changed, you're saying that can be changed, that should be changed.
And in some ways, the halakha as we have it is more limiting of women even than some of the precedent that we have in Torah or in Tanakh.
It's, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think the last sentence is the piece that, you know, that it's sort of like, well, if this is, you know, when she's saying that it's resting on this, like, the honor of the community, then that's a social piece, that it's sort of like, well, so then socially we're deciding that this demeans, so it's like God isn't saying that this degrades, so then we have the ability, we sort of, you know, writing in 1979 to say like, well, hey, like, this isn't God saying this, so we should change it.
Right.
So, you know, and also the piece about, you know, that if they're saying, oh, well, it's compassionate to not make the nursing mothers run around and do this, but there's a whole lot of women who are not nursing mothers, and, you know, why should this then apply to them also as a mandate or to be excluded?
And for that short time that a mother is nursing. And, you know,
Well, and as if she can't take the child with her, sure.
well, right, that would and there would be a bare breast and forget about that.
Yes.
But, sorry. But what my mind goes to too is how the interpretation changed them. If God's word was, you are not obligated to do this, but, you know, that just because you're not obligated doesn't mean you're not supposed to. What were the reasons that it morphed into you are not supposed to do this? You know, and the first thing that comes to my mind, and that's not fair, is about control. I'm sure there were more reasons, but, so, I would like to know.
actually think that's pretty fair.
I'm not so sure.
I think to Melissa's point, I just look at it, I absolutely agree, I would look at it. I think this is a shot across the bow at the halachic establishment, and saying, listen, you guys are pretty smart people. You know, think about all the things which you have developed out of small pieces of Torah. And you don't want to do this because it's nothing to do with the halakha, because you have your social, you see your social roles, and so you're just kind of using that. But if you really wanted to, you could figure this out.
But you know, I think, a little step further, goes, you know, really, this is going to offend your honor. You know?
Yeah.
I said, like, get over it.
I would say, be a man.
So we're not going to do source 7, and I'm actually going to skip source 8 as well. I will tell you, source 8 I think is worthwhile, but I think it's in the wrong lesson. I think this is actually this is a source that's more about sociology and less about halakha, and we're really talking more about sort of, at this point, halakhic roles, gender roles. It's interesting, basically what Fishman talks about is the way in which the shift away from the more traditional approach has disempowered men and has created a sociological challenge, which is that in a lot of progressive circles, women are showing up much more than men, right? In leadership roles and taking responsibility for raising children and taking adult education classes, right? Like happily, I look around, we're pretty balanced gender-wise here, but I think a lot of adult continuing education, women show up more frequently than men. So like, I think she's making those points. They're interesting points. I'm not sure that they're relevant or useful here. I do want to conclude with Rachel Adler in the last few minutes we have. Rachel Adler is a professor at Hebrew Union College. She was one of Miriam's professors, so she can tell you more about Rachel. She wrote a book called Engendering Judaism, which is really a classic, a modern classic, and it's worth reading, and I would say it's all the more relevant now. She was really ahead of her time in a lot of ways in being able to sort of, the things she said at the time, most people couldn't hear her. I have to tell you, the first time I read the book, I couldn't hear her. And now I feel like I can hear her now in ways that I didn't appreciate when I first read her 20 years ago. And so let's spend a couple minutes just reading this. Who wants to start? What does it mean to engender Judaism? And just sort of look for, like, if the other texts were about identifying the problems, Adler is actually going to begin to try to identify a solution, to point us toward a solution. Okay? Who wants to read? What is it? Or where did we leave off last time? Yeah, please.
What does it mean to engender Judaism? Non-Orthodox Judaisms distinguish themselves from Orthodoxy are their beliefs that Jews beget Judaism. They shape and renew Judaism in the various times and places they inhabit. If we accept this premise, it will lead to a new sense in which Judaism needs to be engendered. Jews in the Western world live in societies where the ethical idea for women to be full and equal social participants. But Judaism was only beginning to reflect and to address the questions, understand, please, and obligations of both Jewish women and Jewish men.
Jonathan, you want to take over?
It is not yet fully attended to the impact of gender and sexuality, either on the classical text or on the lived experiences of the people of Israel. Until progressive Judaisms engender themselves in the second sense, they cannot engender fully adequate Judaisms in the first sense. I propose a theology for engendering Judaism in both senses, a way of thinking about practicing Judaism that men and women recreate and renew together as equals.
Aaron?
Relegating gender issues to women alone perpetuates a fallacy about the nature of Judaism. It presumes that Judaism is a body of gender-neutral texts and traditions, and that women constitute a special gendered addendum to the community of its transmitters.
Kind of the point that Ozip was making as well.
It further presumes that while women are represented in Jewish tradition, they are separate from it. Scholarship about their representation is classified as women in or women and is regarded as non-essential knowledge of interest only to women. Men do not need to consider these special topics. They can simply study Judaism. The impact of gender on Judaism is not a women's issue. It is an issue for everyone who seeks to understand Judaism.
So the interesting thing about Adler's biography is that she was an Orthodox Jew. She married an Orthodox, I think maybe even rabbi, and she married an Orthodox guy. And everyone remember the Jewish catalog?
Yes.
Remember the Jewish catalog? So in the first Jewish catalog, Rahel Adler wrote a seminal essay about mikvah. And she talks all about the ways that mikvah is beautiful for women and empowering for women, and it really reads as sort of Orthodox female apologetics. And then the second version of the Jews, by that time she divorced from her husband, she pursued her own career as an academic, she moved really toward Reform Judaism, which I think actually she was born a Reform Jew and was Balat Tshuva and then went back. And then she writes, I think it was maybe even in the second Jewish catalog, essentially a repudiation of her first essay about mikvah. And now she's actually been ordained as a rabbi, and I mean, she's brilliant. She's one of these people that's like so brilliant, you get worried about her driving because she's always, like she's a little scattered, but like super like amazingly brilliant. And this book, one of the things that it did was offer a new paradigm, right? A new halachic paradigm. Ozip maybe is a little more sort of interested in, and maybe even a traditional approach to halacha. I'm not sure, but Adler is less, she's really interested in reconstituting the old forms into newer relevant forms, co-created by men and women as co-equals in the modern era. So for example, a famous example that she comes up with in Engendering Judaism is moving away from traditional marriage frames of kinyan, of acquisition, even mutual acquisition of men and women by each other, and towards something that she calls a brit ahuvim, a lover's covenant. And in fact, our ketubah, we use some of her language from her lover's covenant and the ketubah that hangs in our dining room. And she employs other kinds of, we don't have time to go into it now, but other mechanisms of partnership in halakha, still looking at halakha as an overall set of norms that are useful, but she's not so adherent to legal precedent, right? She doesn't need to sort of grow the new version out of the old version. She's just looking, she's willing to, cherry picking feels dismissive. That's not what she's doing. But she's willing to be more selective about the different aspects and forms of halakha that will support what she sees as a more modern ethos for gender egalitarianism. So I think we'll leave it there, unless there are final comments. Okay, let's take our break, go outside, get a little fresh air if you want. And I'll pause the camera for a minute, and then you're going to look at bar and bat mitzvah.
Find it.
I don't know. Yep.
Yes, it's recording. Okay, hi everybody.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I can't believe
How are you?
I'm good.
Oh, is that it?
I just got back from New York.
that I'm recording with this. I'm like, yeah, just
No. Okay, hi everybody. Yes, I just had 2 days of meetings in New York about my family.
How's it go?
Making progress. Yeah. Family camp. Family camp, I know. I was fundraising in New York.
We're gonna try to spend it.
That's in discussion right now, in the New York region. So that we're driving distance of as many large Jewish communities as possible. DC to Boston. And we saw, I went with a friend, and we saw, has anyone seen how, what the Constitution means to me? It's a fantastic play, and it relates to your topic of the last session. It's only playing till the middle of August, so if any of you are heading to New York between now and then, I highly recommend it. Okay, so we are talking about bar and bat mitzvah today. I can't see you. I'm like, we are going to start by focusing on what bar and bat mitzvah, the idea of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah is about. I don't know that we're going to get to the gender questions tonight, except a little bit.
We figured it all out in the first.
I'm sure you did. But since you were focusing on that last hour, I wanted to spend some time thinking about what is this milestone really all about, because we experience many of them when we go to shul or in our own families, and they seem to have, in many cases, kind of veered off the path of what it's about. So want to bring us back to
New York Times Magazine article recently.
what was that?
I didn't read that, I saw it, but I didn't.
Status of current bat mitzvahs.
Yeah, I almost brought the movie Keeping Up with the Steins to show you, but I didn't. So you can watch it yourself. Yeah, the bar mitzvah and the faux mitzvah and
What's a
we heard about
faux
faux mitzvah. Non-Jews throw big parties for their kids at 13 to mirror. I mean, it's actually a very interesting cultural phenomenon to mirror their Jewish peers. Like whoever thought it would like,
So their kids are jealous.
yeah, that they get big parties and lots of
Yes.
presents.
Wow.
Yeah, Google it, faux mitzvah. So I want to start by just asking the core question, which is on your roadmap. What is the real meaning and significance of becoming bar bat mitzvah? And I want to very clearly say at the outset, one does not have a bar mitzvah. One does not. But you talk about people. When's your bar mitzvah? As if it's a noun or but bar mitzvah is
literally translates to son or daughter of the commandments. One becomes responsible for the commandments. One becomes bar mitzvah or becomes bat mitzvah. One does not have a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. Okay, so what's it about? What does it mean to become bar mitzvah or become bat mitzvah?
Having a big party.
With Neil Diamond.
We lived in LA for, I lived in LA for a decade, and there were some parties. With celebrities and animals, like big animals. Coming in on elephant animals, not kidding. What's it about?
If you're taking on the commandments, that you're now at the age that you can take on the responsibility.
Yeah, so it is about becoming responsible. So mitzvah means commandment. Now, let's try to unpack for a few minutes. What does that mean? What is a commandment? Who's commanding who in your own understanding of Judaism, Jewish life, Jewish practice, God? Who's doing the commanding?
Well, I mean, the Orthodox view, I think, is God is commanding us.
Yes, that's the easy one.
You're asking what do we individually think?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess what I've taken away from this, what I've internalized from this class is it's us commanding ourselves.
Okay, so that's one possibility, right? Taking these traditions on as obligations. Yeah.
It's becoming a member of a responsible member of the Jewish community.
Yeah. And Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who's I think I brought him to you before in a few different source sheets. He's a Reform rabbi working in San Francisco. Wrote a number of books about Jewish mysticism, very accessible, very good books about Jewish mysticism. And he has one book called The Book of Words, where he takes sort of common usage Hebrew words and translates them sort of spiritually, not just literally. And he translates mitzvah as responsible, meaning the ability to respond. So the ability to respond to the needs of the community, for example. Like that when you become 12 or 13, you are able to respond to the needs of others in a way that maybe you could not before.
There's also, just based on my kids' experience, this deep engagement with the text. And really working to be able to chant it, but also, not just the Torah, but the prayer book as well, so that you can really participate in the services in a different way.
Yeah, well, and too many places it's seen as kind of a graduation, right? Like you made it through 7th grade religious school. But it's quite the opposite, right? It's about learning, owning, like beginning a journey of being able to continue to lane and lead services and all of those, all of the everything that has to do with becoming a responsible citizen. And I'll tell you, I'm really struggling with this tonight. For Ellie's, I'm sorry, I went back to you for a minute. For Ellie's bat mitzvah, she asked Daniel and I to tutor her, which we were very honored by the request, and it ended up working out very well, but you never know with a 12-year-old at the time. But we thought that there was going to be something missing for her because there's a relationship that you develop with your tutor, the person who's training you up, That's important and valuable, I think, to have a relationship with another adult or older kid or something like that. So we created something that I call a minion of moms. And we asked 10 women of different generations to be in her minion, and for each one of them to do something with her, take her on an outing or something of the sort, to teach her something of what each of these women understood, what it meant to each of these women to be a responsible citizen of the Jewish people. It was fascinating, because you're right, I think it's a lot about citizenship. She did some really cool things. I was really jealous.
I was gonna say, there's like, I mean, you talk about the things that you, I mean, even for the Seder, I hope they'll realize, if they don't realize now, how cool it is that you're supplying all of that.
One day.
Yeah.
No, they're good. Ellie's in Israel right now with her 8th grade class. Okay, so let's dive in to the sources. And we're going to start with the first couple of texts. So the first one is Jeffrey Salkin. He wrote the book Putting God on the Guest List, which you may have heard of before, about trying to recenter what bar mitzvah is about. And let's just go around. There are a bunch of paragraphs in this one. Start.
There are two calendars of Jewish sacred time, the public and the personal. The public calendar of Jewish sacred time is the festival cycle. The private calendar of Jewish sacred time is the life cycle, birth, maturity, marriage, and death. With the exception of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Jewish spirituality is usually shifted from the festivals to the life cycle. When Jews experience Kedusha, holiness, they invariably experience it in the life cycle: circumcision, baby namings, bar mitzvah, weddings, funerals.
And that's what this class is, right? Into both of these cycles of time. We looked at holidays, and now we're looking at life cycles. Yeah. All right. Continue.
Jewish spirituality has made this shift because Jews no longer share a common spiritual vocabulary. They lack a common Jewish language with its inherited meanings, its sacred calendar, its poetry of word and gesture. But also society has shifted its focus from the group to the self. Individualism has triumphed. The only community that we usually know well is our family. The synagogue has become a place of public spaces and private meetings. The life cycle has become a place then when the Jew can experience moment faiths, sacred moments in life when we realize that there is a God in the world.
Every life cycle experience, we feel connected anew to the Jewish people, to God, Torah. This helps us know that during those moments when we might feel personally drift in the Jewish Judaism, our hope and tribal wisdom is there for us, is waiting for us, is out for us. Bar and bat mitzvah ceremony, visible and even invisible generations are present just as they were present for the sealing of the covenant. Silent, implicit message. Bar and bat mitzvah is the revelation that you can understand. I am not the last Jew in the world.
Knowing that the youth before us embodies all that passed before him or her, that his 13-year-old incarnates Jewish triumphs, tragedies, wisdoms, virtues, and the soaring hopes of a people who have seen himself decimated only to rise again from the blackest of ashes. The river of tears flowing underneath from one bar.
This is not melodramatic.
It's a constant reminder of Jewish yesterday that were fulfilled or frustrated, and of Jewish tomorrow still to come. We don't put too much on our children.
No! What's your reaction to this?
It's very dramatic, but there's a little bit of truth in that.
What's the truth?
I mean, I remember when our kids had their bar mitzvah, there was really a feeling of, we're one in a line of people who have come through this. This is our children becoming part of that chain and hopefully taking it forward. Not so much as it turned out, but we can still hope.
Family can.
Skips generations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is off topic, but I actually got kind of emotional reading this because the category that the categories that he lays out here about the private and public calendar of Jewish sacred time and how Jewish spirituality has shifted the life cycle, and that the life cycle has become the place when Jews experience faith. All that resonates. This is unrelated to B'nai Mitzvah, but that resonates for me, my experience of coming back to Judaism or Jewish practice through the personal ritual of when my father died. So it's just...
It's a dance between the personal and the shared, between the public and the private. Absolutely, and I think, did you have something to say?
Well, not to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Not important enough to do
No.
that. No, but I'm saying, we're talking about, you know, sort of what is the meaning of the home bar earlier. We talked about a lot of the excess, you know, sort of what it's become. But I was thinking, and I think, you know, that Salkin says once the same thing. It is a time when as children, with our children, when we try to get from I am a Jew, that we've got to grow up, and I'm Jewish, to where you really start to put the meaning on and hope that some of it sticks. You know, a lot of us don't do enough to ensure that it sticks, but it's yeah, and you do it in these ways because it does connect generations. You talk about generations, and it really, you know, I think puts the bar mitzvah in the place in time, or on the timeline. Whereas prior to that, when they're young, they know the Jewish, they know the holidays, Hanukkah.
They have to own it, right?
You're offering it up, really, probably for the first time in a very serious way.
And I think that for me, the most important thing he says here is pointing out this dynamic between the community and the individual. And if I were to name something about, besides the excess, about where our sort of current state of affairs is when it comes to becoming bar mitzvah, is that it has become very much about the individual. And you know, trying to decide what to say out loud right now. I went to many ceremonies over the last year with Ali in different places, and the thing that irked me the most were the times when we were in places where the bar bat mitzvah family would greet their personal, would have like an oneg lunch or whatever for their personal guests, and there'd be something else for the community. Why is that so problematic?
Because you're separating yourself from the community.
So if this is about stepping up to yes, stepping up to become a responsible member of the community, and the first thing you do is separate.
But the clergy there allowed it.
Yes, and cultures are embedded and hard to change, and I'm not passing judgment on any particular place or person. I only share it because I think it's a really good example of, and at least from my perspective, what it is and it's not about.
Well, that's why I'm a little, I take your point, but I have a little trouble with this separation of the public and the personal in the bar mitzvah case, because at least the way it's done at Beth Am, and I don't have experience elsewhere, is it feels very much embedded in the community. In fact, I remember long before we had kids, or when our kids were young, I remember going to a bunch and really enjoying it, even if I didn't know the family. And then one time they said, oh, somebody didn't show up, Sally. I didn't know the family. Will you carry the Torah? So I'm carrying the Torah at somebody else's. But mitzvah, luckily I dressed nicely.
You weren't wearing heels that were too high?
No, not a problem that I have. So, I don't know, there's a way in which these are much more connected, and he's drawing a
Well,
dichotomy.
I think ideally they are, but in many, there are many shows that, people joke about them being bar mitzvah factories. And that the people who come to the services are the guests of the bar mitzvah, and that the regulars are a much smaller crowd, and it's symptomatic of larger issues in modern Jewish life and practice. It's not, this isn't the cause of the problem, this is a symptom. So turn the page, look at text 2, or if it's on the same page for you. So this is from the Mishnah. It says, Bein shalosh esrei lamitzvot. At the age of 13, one is obligated to perform the commandments. Do you have to have an aliyah?
No.
Do you have to have a party?
No.
Do you have to teach Torah?
No.
What do you have to do?
Turn 13.
Turn 13. Yeah. So one becomes bar mitzvah at 13, and bat mitzvah is a little questionable whether it's at 12 or 13, and hopefully we'll get to that. But on your birthday, you become obligated whether or not you have a ceremony or a party. Look with me. We're gonna bless you. Focus on that question in a second. Look at supplement A, also from Jeff Salkin. Have you and your parents discussed why you're becoming bar mitzvah? I asked. There was silence. So I prodded, trying to elicit a reaction. Bless you. Why are they doing this? Why are you becoming bar mitzvah? It's what you do, he replied. It's a tradition. It was clear to me that they spent more time deliberating which video to rent than they had spent discussing the deeper meaning behind bar mitzvah. They are not alone in their reticence. Many American Jews lack, yet secretly desire, a vocabulary to help them address the central questions behind God, prayer, Torah, and mitzvot. They are not exclusively to blame for this silence. They inherited a suburbanized, secularized, often trivialized American Judaism that had not adequately raised those questions. To the 20th century Israeli poet Abraham Shlonsky, their Judaism was like a mezuzah from which the sacred parchment had been removed. It was spiritually empty. A generation ago, many Jews thought that being ethical or eating pastrami on rye would be enough to sustain Jewish identity. This hasn't been enough. Not when anyone, Jew or Gentile, can be ethical, and not when anyone, Jew or Gentile, can enter a delicatessen. So, how do we put the parchment back in the mezuzah? And how do we do that at age 13? Why at age 13? So the next series of texts address this question of why 13. And I'm going to invite you to look at 3, 4, 5, and 6 in Hebrew. So we're going to spend a good chunk, 10 to 12 minutes or so, looking for responses to this question, why 13, in the next 4 texts. Any questions? You can work in 2s or 3s, but let's spend some time diving in a little bit.
Probably 3, yeah.
And if you have questions, let me know. Have any of you ever watched the video? Should I pause it while we're doing Chavruta? I'm going to pause it.
Yes.
25.
Okay. So what did you discover? The Mishnah says at 13. Why 13? The Mishnah says at age 13, one becomes obligated to the mitzvah. Why 13? We have a lot of different explanations here.
Average time of becoming sexually active?
Case capable.
Not necessarily.
So
We're trying
so why would that,
Throw it a little.
why would that obligate you to the mitzvah? Or the time of sexual awakening?
Well, so this right after response was, students think that's when that's when you have to start being responsible for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're responsible for yourself, you're responsible for you as well.
What else? What
There's
does
this,
physical sexual maturation have to do with mitzvah?
well, there's this parallel drawn between the story of Adam and Eve, this idea that there's a connection between sexual awareness and understanding and knowledge of one another.
Would you agree?
The
I don't know, I think you get
hormones
pretty-
cloud.
I think you get pretty stupid.
Yeah,
Boys in particular.
So one of the intentions of mitzvot, as we have come to understand sort of the system of obligations, of sacred responsibilities, is to help us to kind of structure, put a structure and framework around our, we talked a few weeks ago about Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara, about our good inclination and our bad inclination is a bad, like our lusty inclination, I guess is a better one. So if one of the purposes of the mitzvot is to help us order our lives, moderate, mediate, be responsible, then once those urges start awakening, it would make sense that we would need the kids, right, at that point, to kind of buy into the system. What else?
So this wasn't explicitly in the text, but it seemed like another connection to puberty is that's when a time when kids are starting to see themselves as independent from the parents. And if you're independent, you're not just taking orders, then you need to think about what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of what Kramer was saying.
Yeah.
And if you are at a stage where you can yourself become a parent, right?
Actually, the last supplement really supports that Abraham's obviously breaking from his father's.
Right, so some of you got to the supplement, some of you did not. So supplement B
No, I didn't read it.
basically says that Bezalel, the artist who built the Mishkan, was 13 when he was called to task. And the midrash that people often get confused about whether it's actually in the Torah or not, it's not, about Abraham smashing the idols, that he did that when he was 13. So what does that tell us about how what else does that tell us about how the rabbis perceive the age of 13?
You have agency.
Agency. Yeah, and that was the same in the text about Jacob and Esau, right? They had agency. One chose to go study, one chose to go hunt. And capacity, right? Bezalel was capable of building the Mishkan at 13. Now, the Mishnah came first, right? And all of the sources we're looking at are the rabbis of different generations trying to understand why the rabbis of the Mishnah would have said 13. So we have a sexual maturity, we have a sort of an agency, a certain kind of, I don't know if I'd call it emotional maturity, but the
Separation, start to separate.
yeah. So breaking from his father. So the rabbis then associate all of the, sort of the physical, the spiritual, the psychological breaks that start to happen at this age. What do you think about Kramer's claim that determining a particular age and separating bar or bat mitzvah from the physical maturation is a problem?
you know, I never thought of it, but it actually, there's something to that. It actually resonates with me in terms of when our kids became 13. Why?
Right, and two points to that. One is there are some kids who at 13 seem ready to do this and some kids who don't, right? And also, I think what Kramer's pointing to is that our tradition has to speak to the real lives of people. So if this is a major shift, you know, as kids move to this liminal space, I don't want to say they become adults because they don't, then the tradition should speak to that moment of transition in their lives. Other thoughts or questions about 13?
Just on that, so any age, pick an age to say, do something, don't do something, is arbitrary. You know, that, 30-year-olds can be different. The difference between 30 years and less than the difference between 13-year-olds. But, well, no, but so any is arbitrary, but to do it a little bit more, they can go back to the physical development.
Yeah.
Not to speak of emotional development at all. That creates problems within tribes, within cultures of their own, and those problems may sort of be lifelong. You know, if you start separating, segregating at an age. I was just thinking, this is, I don't know if anybody would know the answer, but there's a lot of African tribes that have manhood rituals. I'm not sure that,
Some of it includes circumcision.
but are they, that's my question would be, are they age-based or are they maturity-based?
Depends on the tribe, there are different tribes, you know.
Both, yeah. But so I mean, I can see sort of why they got arbitrary, as we tend to do, usually go for school-age children.
Right.
Still do it to some extent.
Simple.
We're getting a little bit, right?
It's simple.
And I think there's an emotional development piece that even though 2 13-year-olds may be different in terms of their emotional development at 13, you really scar one.
Yeah.
You can really retard development or affect development when you start segregating people from kids who others who would otherwise be their peers.
Yeah.
Think on it, yeah, you know, I'm even thinking so in some circles, there's the pressure to have a big, expensive party or that kind of thing, but, you know, so my 3 kids did go to Schefter, and there was a whole other set of pressure, which wasn't about parties. I mean, at least the classes they were in, it really wasn't about parties, but it was, you know, about who could do more of the Torah reading, who had the better voice, and that becomes, you know, an interesting kind of, and also what kids, who's ready to, you know, I just was thinking how, and also the other thing that, the one that Salkin and that last paragraph, and that's how I felt that my kids were, when they became bar mitzvah, they became bar mitzvah, is, you know, with knowing that the youth before the bodies all that passed before him or her, that this our makes Jewish shrines with virgin. I mean, I think in a way, and his drama with it, I think that is a problem, because I think it's this transgenerational burden that we can, you know, I think that can easily be given, to, you know, especially post-Holocaust, that could easily be given to our children, or has been given. I think it was given to our generation.
I would only say that burden is a loaded word, right, with negative connotations. And it's an opportunity too, right?
Yeah, but I think we need to be in Jewish education believe very strongly, and, you know, I had, that we really need to be careful about the burden, especially in the Schechter School where they still teach kids at a very young age about the Holocaust, which I think is completely inappropriate. So I think that it's a fine line, and I just think that, and I think at least our generation were brought up like with a little bit of that burden, and I'm not trying.
So I think what you're pointing
Because
to,
that's how I think it can be at that tender age of 12 and 13. Now, some kids can just completely ignore it because they do it, and then some kids can take it. And I think how we do it, not just in terms of, it's, you know, sometimes it makes such a big deal. I mean, you don't even have to read Torah, yet we make that the biggest deal. And I think that we are not being sensitive overall to the age group. And, you know, there are going to be kids who can perform, kids who can't perform. Your ability to read Torah is not, doesn't mean you can become a foreign bar mitzvah. It's because you just are a certain age. So I having come from where the party was not the big deal, it was the reading Torah and the Billowing Pasadim was wonderful. I think it can go, you know, I like, not that you would just arbitrarily pick an age, but I think thinking about that in terms of.
well, look, and that's why in the Reform movement for a long time they kind of did away with bar mitzvah and replaced it with confirmation, because in 10th grade. They presumed kids were at a more mature age to be able to say, like, I confirm my identity, right? I own this. And I think also it's about framing. Like, is it the burden? Is it, there's a great essay, I'm blanking on who wrote it, which is embarrassing, called Jews, the Ever-Dying People. So, you know, we're always on the brink of extinction. So, are we framing this as, like, you know, in terms of carrying the burden of all those who we've lost along the way, or about the opportunity for all those to, you know, for us and for all those to come? So I want to just point out also, and then I think we're gonna address the gender question in our last 10 minutes. In the text 4 about Jacob and Esau, I heard some of you chuckling with thereafter he must say, blessed is he who is absolved me for responsibility from this one. This is actually the traditional bracha said at a bar or bat mitzvah ceremony. Baruch Shemtarani. Which in some ways is like, I throw my hands up, it's all you.
It should only be.
But there's also something, when you talk about agency, right, there's also something about the kid being responsible at this point, or more responsible for the consequences of his or her actions. So I want to jump ahead to text 10, because I want to engage in a little debate for our last few minutes here. So I just want to look at the second paragraph. The first paragraph talks about sort of the development of bat mitzvah, how it was just Friday night and it was not Torah and it grew and changed and whatnot. The second paragraph says this: in order to ensure that the bat mitzvah has received the same education or preparation as the bar mitzvah, it has become necessary to have the bat mitzvah ceremony when a girl reaches her 13th birthday, even though she becomes a bat mitzvah when she reaches her 12th birthday. This enables the congregation to guarantee an equal education to all students in the afternoon school. With the increased number of children attending Solomon Schechter Day School, some congregations have permitted on a case-by-case basis a bat mitzvah ceremony when a girl reaches her 12th birthday. So girls technically become bat mitzvah at 12, boys technically at 13. So given the conversations you had in your first hour with Daniel tonight, what's your reaction to normalizing 13 for everyone.
Okay, and that's a good question.
Yeah.
Where's 12 come from for girls? If it
The
wasn't,
maturity level
well,
probably.
no, I mean, so is the Mishnah that says that, you know, that a girl's obligated?
It's not Mishnah, but it's later.
Okay, but, yeah, so,
I have to,
and is it framed as that's when they become obligated to follow them?
yeah, yes, because girls tend to physically mature sooner than boys. It's tied to that.
Well, if you tie confirmation classes, we utilize the height of them.
Right, that's true. All those pictures that later embarrass the boys. So what do you think about normalizing 13 for boys and girls? What's your reaction?
Kind of fits with one of the readings we did that was the male is the default is the norm, and the girl becomes the subcategory, or the
Yeah.
female becomes the subcategory.
Right, so we've made the male normative in choosing 13. And saying everyone is now going to celebrate at 13. What do you think of that?
Well, boys are barely ready at 13, they certainly won't be ready at 12. If you're looking to keep, that probably is the better choice. I understand it looks, and that may be a result of using the male as the norm.
Does it need to be the same?
Yeah.
Hey, for-
Why
for-
should it be the same?
for the-
Because the way that the meets vote, I mean, women aren't expected to do the same things, so why can't we just have 12 instead of 13? I mean,
Women
it's
aren't expected to
convenient.
do the same thing by whom?
But the first hour discussion was
Yeah.
about, the time-based, and all of that, and it says that women aren't obligated, it doesn't say that they can't,
Right,
right?
but and I assume you looked at some of this, right? In our day, there are women who take on many women who take on the same week's vote as men.
Sure, yeah, right. But what I'm saying is, if it's kind of baked into halacha now that it's this separate thing, then why should we back up and say, okay, everyone, girls are gonna be 13, let's do 13.
Right, and this is a very practical explanation for that. And let's also just name that this is binary.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I would.
Yeah. And then go ahead.
I'm sorry, so I go back to what I said, any age you pick is arbitrary.
Mhm.
So picking 12 is arbitrary. And when the male rabbis pick 12, and I would say you could argue, it's not that 13 is normal for males, they just oppose the allegation that we're born girls earlier, because we're getting out of the house earlier, we're marrying them off younger, so I'm not so sure that that was in response to physical maturity, although it may well have been. But to me,
And what's most important in this moment? Is it about the physical maturity? Is it about the agency? Is it about the psychological maturity?
and I would say ideally,
Mhm.
whenever your child's ready. That's when.
Right, but then
the
how do you
allegation-
determine that?
But that's, well, whether you count pubic hairs, or there's some, or there's some, some emotional, something.
I can't imagine many teenagers wanting their peers to know when they grow up.
Well, that's just.
Let's be honest.
Privacy
Being
can
checked.
Right, and it could be traumatic for the late developers.
Yeah.
So-
And how come it's 3 stars for
Um,
Shabbat potato?
So,
Sorry, I don't know why that stuck in my head. But anyway. It's like consistency.
Anyway, we're not about.
I think 12 and 13 may have worked very well, when girls and boys were completely separate environments, which they were in many places for a long time. But if, so if they're, but if, in schools, but if they're in school together, I think you have to have something, that's, you have to have some equivalency there. So otherwise, I think we create all kinds of problems.
Well, I
But
mean,
why is the equivalency of the male norm?
Well, That's
I think
okay.
we should push it
But yeah,
higher range
yeah,
as possible.
yeah.
Yeah, Erin.
I guess that was kind of my thought, that why equalize it? Because if the girl actually is going to be doing these things that before,
Right.
when it was like, well, 12 is the age, but she wasn't going to be called up to read. She wasn't going to be called up to do anything. And now if we're saying, well, we're sort of teaching them at the same rate, and if we're sort of teaching them in a group setting, that okay, if so that she has the same amount of time to prepare, and if your curriculum is sort of preparing for doing that, versus just if we're sort of learning on your own, then.
Well, the other, in an English-based, 13, you're a teenager. That's like the really easy way out.
So I want to bring us back to the beginning when we talked about becoming bar or bat mitzvah on your birthday. So I think there's also a distinction to be made here about when a child becomes obligated to the mitzvot and when the ceremony and celebration happens. So I'll tell you from our own stories, this is what happens when you have two rabbis married to each other. We were really struggling with this for our daughter, that we were uncomfortable with the male normative, especially for our daughter who's very much a feminist, but we were also uncomfortable with pushing her a year ahead of sort of what has become manhag and custom. So we created our own solution. I don't know of anyone else who's ever done this, and I don't know how we'll feel about it later, but we decided, and by the way, this is also like, a lot of kids don't celebrate becoming bar bat mitzvah on their actual birthday. So when, and then they think about like, well, now I'm bar mitzvah because I've had my ceremony,
This
right?
will be your summer birthday, Beth.
Yes, my daughter.
My son, right?
So, air conditioning now, so who knows? In any event, what we decided is that at age 12, she would become obligated to all of the personal mitzvot. So the ones that are between her and God. So saying the blessings over food and birkat hamazon and lighting candles and all of those sorts of things. And when she had her ceremony, which was before she was 13, because she's a summer birthday, when she had her ceremony, that is when she would become obligated to the public mitzvot. So that's when she could start counting in a minyan and when she could lead a congregation in prayer and those sorts of things, because she has stepped into her communal responsibilities in the ceremony. So I share that just as a kind of way to think about some of the questions we've been discussing tonight. I have a last completely, well not completely, unrelated question that I want to put out on the table if any of you want to share with me after class or at any time in the future. I was meeting this morning with someone from a major Jewish foundation, and he said they're really trying to crack the nut of adult education. And he said, to the students in your Melton class, like what motivates them to come? Is it the content? Is it that there aren't a lot of serious Jewish learning opportunities, and this is one of the few that's out there? Or is it the particular content of the classes, or is it something else? And I told him that I would ask you, because they're really trying to puzzle this one through, and how as a foundation they can direct dollars to help lift up opportunities for adult engagement and education. So I leave you with that question, right, which is in some ways very much related to what we're talking about. I will see you next
How would
week.
you like to receive our answer?
However you wish. I am, however, going to turn on the camera.